This is Jennifer Douglas, a US citizen. She used to be the fourth wife of Atiku Abubakar. She's a prominent character in this story that dates back to the 1980s when this man, the Waziri of Adamawa, was beginning to build something great for himself. Something so tiny, but that would later be worth a fortune. We'll be going over some case files to examine how, from the year 2000 to 2008, Ms. Douglas operated over 30 bank accounts in the United States, helping her husband bring over $40 million in suspect funds into the United States, including at least $1.7 million in bribe payments from Siemens AG, a German corporation, and over $38 million from little-known offshore corporations, primarily Let's Go Limited Incorporation, Guernsey Trust Company Nigeria Limited, and Sima Holding Limited. And we'll also be diving into the story of the famous American University of Nigeria to see their role in all of this. There are bank records that will help us show how Ms. Douglas used most of the funds placed into her accounts to support a lavish lifestyle in the United States, paying credit card bills and household expenses in the range of $10,000 to $90,000 per month, including substantial legal and accounting bills. We'll also see how Ms. Douglas, who claimed to be a student, was able to send $1 million in donations to the American University in Washington, D.C., shortly before the American school granted her husband the license to operate their franchise here in Nigeria. She also transferred funds to accounts she opened for a non-profit corporation she established in the year 2002. The Jude Foundation, an organization that pays her over $50,000 in salaries. These files will also help us see how part of the funds transferred into the US were also transferred to the American University of Nigeria, a university that Mr. Abubakar founded in 2003 and whose name reflects its association with American University in the United States. For this episode of Declassified, I went through a document of over 300 pages to understand this complicated web of transactions involving over 30 bank accounts in the United States, with origin from at least 3 different countries. This is the story of Atiku Abubakar, the public servant, businessman with an enormous wealth. But the most important question we are trying to answer with this one is, why did the US place Atiku on some form of unofficial blacklist? This is Declassified. Let's uncover the truth. Mr. Atiku Abubakar, who spent 20 years in the Nigerian Customs Service and then worked in the private sector for 10 years before serving as Vice President of Nigeria from 1999 to 2007, has been facing questions for decades on the source of his wealth. The story started in 1989 when Atiku Abubakar worked for the Nigerian Customs Service, rising to the rank of Deputy Director before leaving the service as he couldn't attain the position he so desperately wanted. The next 10 years saw Atiku work in the private sector with interest in oil, media, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, and publishing. In multiple interviews, including his biography, Mr. Atiku Abubakar has attributed his substantial wealth to fortunate investments, stating that he became wealthy through wise investments, hard work, and sheer luck of being at the right place at the right time. Atiku has claimed that his wealth is attributable in part to a 16% ownership interest he held in Integrated Logistics Services Incorporation, a company known as Intels. Intels is an oil services company formed in the 1980s, which has now become one of the largest Nigerian companies in the oil industry in Africa. But the story about this formation is not too clear. In the 1980s, Mr. Atiku Abubakar entered into a business venture with an Italian businessman known as Gabriel Volpi through a company formed to provide oil and natural gas services at African ports. According to a biography of Mr. Atiku, which was written with his support and encouragement, Mr. Abubakar and Mr. Volpe formed this oil logistics company in the early 1980s as a Nigerian corporation called Nigerian Container Services Inc., known as Nicotex. Some sources indicated that the company had a third founder as well, that is the late General Shehu Musa Yaradua, a political mentor to Mr. Atiku Abubakar, and the elder brother of the late Nigerian president Umaru Musa Yaradua, whose story of course we're going to look at in another episode of this series. According to the Atiku Abubakar biography, Mr. Atiku formed this company while he was a customs official. I know this is where lots of folks will say, yeah, he's not supposed to have a private business while in public office. And you will be right if you hold that opinion. But the law that prohibits that in Nigeria didn't come into effect until 1991. So let's let him off the hook for now. In 1996, Sani Abacha, the then president of Nigeria, seized control of the Nicotex shares belonging to Mr. Abubakar and Mr. Yaradua, and he renamed the company Integrated Logistics Services, known as Intels. After Mr. Abacha's death 2 years later in 1998, Mr. Volpe returned the shares to Mr. Abubakar. According to Mr. Volpe's legal counsel, in 1999, Mr. Volpe and Mr. Abubakar agreed that Mr. Atiku could reclaim a 16% holding of the issued share capital of Intel Services. In 2003, Mr. Volpe and Mr. Atiku again agreed to reinstate Mr. Abubakar's full financial interest in the company. So, wait a minute. The first agreement was in 1999, just when Atiku was about to become the vice president. And the second agreement for his reinstatement was in 2003, the year Atiku and his boss Obasanjo got re-elected into office. So, well, hold whatever thoughts you have for now. I promise you it's not what you think. The company is now one of the largest Nigerian companies in the African oil industry, operating oil terminals and oil services zones at ports in several countries including Nigeria, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, and Sao Tome and Principe. In fact, ExxonMobil, the American oil giant, told the US Senate that in less than 3 years, from 2006 to the fall of 2008, it paid more than $245 million to Intel's West Africa Incorporation and Intel's Nigeria Incorporation, two Intel's affiliates, for providing oil services to them in Nigeria. So where are we with the Atiku and his rise to power? After 10 years in the private sector, in May 1999, Mr. Abubakar was elected Vice President of Nigeria under President Olusegun Obasanjo, a position he held for 8 years until May 2007. By the time he took office, Nigerian law banned full-time public officials from engaging in private business activities other than farming. This meant his business with Intels was going to be a challenge. But no worries, says Atiku. On July 22, 1999, Mr. Atiku Abubakar established a blind trust under Nigerian law. According to the trustees, the blind trust was formed to hold and manage his assets, businesses, and investments. The sole asset placed in the trust was Mr. Abubakar's Intel shares, which then represent a 16% holding in the issued share capital of Intel Services Limited. Come on, Jude, what the hell is a blind trust again? Now, calm down, I was going to explain. Normally, blind trusts are managed by a trustee who is independent of both the grantor who places assets into the trust and the trust beneficiaries. That is, whoever the trust is willed to. So, with blind trust, there is supposed to be some form of triangular relationship, if you know what I mean. On the one side of the triangle is the grantor of the trust. On the other side is the trustee, and then finally we have the beneficiaries. In establishing a qualified blind trust, you will need the approval of the appropriate supervisory ethics entity. When this is done, a public official can then transfer without any form of restriction and control and management of private assets to an independent trustee who may not communicate information about the identity of the holdings in the trust to the official. So, in simple terms, The public official is to have nothing to do with the trust or have any knowledge of whatever their financial statements or investments are for the duration of time he spends in office. Does it make sense? So the trust is considered blind because eventually, through the sale of transferred assets and the purchase of new ones, the public officer will be shielded from knowledge of the identity of the specific assets in the trust. Without such knowledge, conflict of interest issues would be avoided because no particular asset in the trust could act as an influence upon the official duties that the public officer performs for the government. So that was why Atiku created a blind trust. So let's go back to Atiku now. In the case of the Atiku Abubakar blind trust, His Excellency did not appoint any independent trustee from a financial institution, but instead he appointed corporations associated with, remember Mr. Volpe, who was described as Mr. Abubakar's trusted friend and business partner? Yeah, that's the one. The initial trustee of the blind trust appointed in 1999 was a Panamanian corporation called Olean Invest Holdings Limited. Olean is another oil services company with offices in London, Nigeria, and several other West African countries, and closely associated with Intels. They were the initial trustee of the blind trust appointed by Atiku to manage his business interest in 1999. So pause here for a second. Do you remember an initial agreement between Mr. Atiku and Mr. Volpe in 1999 to reinstate Atiku into Intels? Well, Atiku's 16% shares in Intels was the only asset class held by the trustee. I hope you're following. In case you're not, here's a brief summary of the events again. When Mr. Atiku Abubakar took office in 1999, he placed his Intel shares in a blind trust. But instead of selecting an independent trustee from a financial firm, Mr. Atiku appointed Olean Invest Holding Limited as trustee of his blind trust. Olean is a corporation registered in Panama and is active in the oil industry in Africa. But what is stunning is that Olean is closely associated with Intels, whose share Atiku has placed in this blind trust, and is partly owned by Gabriel Volpe, who is the chairman of Intels and Mr. Atiku Abubakar's trusted friend and business partner. So, does it make sense now? Back to our story. Olean served as trustee of the Atiku Abubakar Blind Trust from 1999 to, wait for it, 2003, when the trustees exchanged the Intel shares for shares in Olean, thereby making the trust part owner of his own trustee. What? So the blind trust is now a part owner of his own trustee. Olean then resigned from the Abubakar Blind Trust and was replaced by another company called Gwensi Trust Company Nigeria Limited, a Nigerian shell company that was formed the day before the new appointment. But while checking through the company's record, we found a familiar name again, Mr. Volpe. He is one of 3 trustees of the Gwensi Trust Company, whose sole activity is managing the Abubakar's Blind Trust. Mr. Volpe further told the US Senate subcommittee that he is the chairman of Olean and that the Volpe Family Trust currently owns 63% of the company through Sima Holdings, a company that will feature in our story shortly. Now, the US subcommittee was told that from 1999 to 2003, Olean managed the Abubakar's Blind Trust, including the Intel shares, and the profits generated thereby were utilized in developing new business initiatives and investments, particularly in Nigeria, Angola, Congo, Brazzaville, and the Ivory Coast. According to the Gwensi Trust Company's legal counsel, in 2003, Olean reorganized and acquired Atiku Abubakar's beneficial interest in Intel's Services Limited for Olean's benefit, and then issued in consideration a 16% of their own shares in Olean to the blind trust for the benefit of Atiku Abubakar. They just exchanged shares. Atiku gave them his 16% shares and they gave Atiku 16% shares in their own company. So, in other words, Mr. Abubakar exchanged his 16% ownership interest in Intel for an equivalent ownership interest in Olean, the company that was managing his blind trust. His acquisition of the Olean shares meant that he became a part owner of the trustee of his blind trust. Pretty confusing, but that was basically what he did. This was the second agreement that was enacted in 2003. Told ya, not what you think, just kind of worse. So on October 10th, 2003, Olean was replaced by Gwenzi Trust Company Nigeria Limited, a shell company formed one day earlier under the laws of Nigeria. Legal counsel to the Gwenzi Trust Company told the subcommittee that this company has 3 beneficial owners who provide the trustee services required by the Abubakar Blind Trust. We have Gabriel Volpe, Oyuekpen Geya Osaji, and Fati Akintola Kekere Ekun. Mr. Jiwa Osagi is the managing partner in the Nigerian law firm Jiwa Osagi and Associates, which provides legal advice to the Gwenzi Trust Company. Mr. Kekere Ekun was the Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of Habib National Bank Limited in Nigeria at the time. He is also a trustee on the American University of Nigerian Board of Trustees and was chosen in part due to his reliability and relationship with Mr. Atiku Abubakar. So how did this trust being managed by Atiku's shell company play a part in Atiku's troubles with the United States? From 2003 to 2008, the Gwenzi Trust Company transferred at least $10 million into the United States, including at least $7 million to Douglas-related accounts at several US banks, $2.1 million to the Wenderfield Law Office and AUN accounts at SunTrust Bank, and $900,000 to American University accounts. When questioned about all of these transactions, Ms. Douglas, Wenderfield, and American University each told the US Senate that they had no information about the Gwenzi Trust Company and that they were unaware of its relation to the Abubakar Blind Trust and did not deal with the Gwenzi Trust Company trustees. But somehow, they had simply assumed that the funds sent by the Gwenzi Trust Company belonged to Mr. Atiku Abubakar. But why is this even an issue, you may ask? You see, Atiku Abubakar was the Vice President of Nigeria, who is banned from having private businesses as a public officer. So he sets up a blind trust, but then appoints his friends as trustees and then uses his shell company to make huge money deposits to accounts domiciled in the United States. According to Mr. Volpe, Mr. Atiku Abubakar was the sole beneficial owner of the Gwenzi Trust Company, a company that sent multiple payments into accounts held by his wife, Ms. Douglas. 2 other companies beneficially owned by Mr. Volpe and his relatives, that is Let's Go and Sima Holdings, sent nearly $27 million into the United States, including about $8 million to Ms. Douglas's accounts, $5.5 million to AUN accounts, and $13.1 million to American University accounts. When asked about all of these wire transfers, Mr. Volpe told the US Senate that the funds sent to Ms. Douglas related to a moral agreement by Mr. Volpe with Mr. Atiku Abubakar to acknowledge Mr. Abubakar's financial interest in Intel after General Sani Abacha had seized Mr. Abubakar's shares. Remember that Atiku had served as Vice President of Nigeria from 1999 to 2007. Now in 2006, President Olusegun Obasanjo attempted to amend the Nigerian constitution to allow him to run for a 3rd term. Mr. Atiku opposed that effort, leading to a falling out between the two. After President Obasanjo's effort failed, an election for a new president was scheduled, and Mr. Atiku announced his candidacy for that election. In response, the Nigerian Independent National Electoral Commission ruled that he was disqualified from running for president because he was under some form of investigation for corruption. During the presidential campaign, the Nigerian Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, our good friends the EFCC, under the leadership of Nuhu Ribadu, initiated a corruption investigation of several Nigerian government officials, including Mr. Atiku Abubakar. The EFCC simply issued a report which found that Mr. Atiku Abubakar had used his influence over Nigeria's Petroleum Technology Development Fund, known as the PTDF, to disburse money from the fund to promote business ventures for himself and his friends, and that he had engaged in fraudulent conversion of funds, corrupt practices, and money laundering. In February 2007, a Nigerian ad hoc Senate committee was formed to examine the EFCC charges against Atiku. But Mr. Atiku made a presentation to the committee asserting in part that the allegations were a bid to prevent him from running for office. The Nigerian Senate committee subsequently called for Mr. Atiku Abubakar to be sanctioned because he had abused his office by aiding and abetting the diversion of public funds in the sum of $145 million as loans to his friends. While the former Vice President, Mr. Atiku Abubakar, was the subject of corruption allegations relating to the Nigerian Petroleum Technology Development Fund, in December 2008, the US Securities and Exchange Commission alleged in a formal complaint against Siemens AG, a German company, that, among other actions, in 2001 and 2002, Siemens wire transferred $2.8 million in bribe payments to a US bank account belonging to a certain Ms. Douglas as part of a scheme to bribe Nigerian officials. Siemens admitted to engaging in widespread bribery with a record of 174 payments. The German company pleaded guilty to criminal violations and agreed to pay over $1.6 billion in civil and criminal fines. However, the recipient of the money, Ms. Douglas, denied any wrongdoing, even after the subcommittee constituted by the US Senate obtained financial records showing the transfer of over $1.7 million from Siemens AG to Ms. Douglas's account at Citibank. Furthermore, on August 5, 2009, US Congressman William Jefferson was convicted by a federal jury of soliciting bribes, money laundering, depriving citizens of honest services as a member of Congress, and operating his congressional office as a racketeering enterprise. During his trial, a videotape was shown in which the congressman made a reference to Mr. Atiku Abubakar when the congressman was seeking money from another person. But no evidence was introduced showing that Mr. Abubakar had actually sought or accepted a bribe from the congressman. Mr. Atiku claimed he was innocent and that his name had been invoked in the matter to ruin his reputation and prevent him from winning the presidency in Nigeria. You see, the US Senate subcommittee contacted Atiku Abubakar through his legal counsel, but he declined to participate in any form of interview. Throughout this story, every major suspicious transaction that has linked to Atiku followed bank accounts opened, owned, or operated by a certain Miss Douglas. So, what's her story? That is the question we're going to answer in the part 2 of the Atiku Abubakar story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in that episode.